All right, we are now live on YouTube and we are back being recorded. Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, kia ora tātou. Welcome to the first strategy and operations meeting for 2022. I hope you all had a good Christmas break and ready to get back into the grind of council matters. Hope you just bear with me as we all get used to meeting via Zoom again. Quite a large agenda today, and also we have other meetings back to back as well. So I have to balance moving through quick enough that we get finished in time, but not so fast that I leave our lovely DEM services behind and they can't record the minutes and so forth. So I might pause here and there just to allow them to keep up. I also am using two monitors. I broke my laptop over the holidays, so please forgive me if you're watching via YouTube as a resident or to elected members if I'm not looking directly at the screen the whole time, although I know DEM services are in the same position using multiple screens as well.
And may I just interrupt you? Sorry, Mr. Chair. I forgot to ask everybody to unmute themselves and then I'll mute. So if everybody could just do that now, I apologise. I should have got that done at the start.
Your watch.
All right, Councillor Randall and Mr. Burns, if you could just unmute.
Is that better?
Councillor Randall, you're still on mute. There we go. All right. All right, now those who are hosts and co-hosts should be able to unmute themselves and we should be away. I apologise for that delay.
Thanks, Fiona. All right, team, thanks for that. So we're going to move to item number 2 of the agenda, which is the council blessing, and I'm going to ask Councillor Halliday to read the blessing.
Kia ora, everyone. As we deliberate on the issues before us, we trust that we will reflect positively on the communities we serve. Let us all seek to be effective and just so that with courage, vision and energy, we provide positive leadership in a spirit of harmony and compassion.
Thank you, Martin. And so with that, we move to item number 2, the apologies. We have an apology from His Worship, the Mayor, who can't attend today. And we have Councillor Pravanov for lateness as well. Did we have any other apologies that I've missed, Fiona?
None that have been sent through to me.
And a little bit rusty, remind me, do we need to move to accept those apologies or is it just noting?
I think you can just move and just note them.
Yeah, I think it's just noting. So we move on then on to item number 4 of the agenda, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. I've not been made aware of any, but if you do have an interest, just raise your virtual hand in the reactions tab and staff will unmute you. I'll just allow a couple of seconds for anyone to do that and for staff to scan the screen.
I haven't seen any hands raised.
Okay. And so we then move on to item number 5, public speaking time for items relating to the agenda. Do we have anyone that's registered for public speaking?
There are no registered public speakers.
Thank you. Item number 6A is public speaking time responses. There obviously is none. Item 6B, does anyone have a leave of absence? Once again, just raise your virtual hand if you want to request a leave of absence.
Again, no hands are up.
Oh, thank you. That's nice. Item 6C, matters of an urgent nature, none have been made aware to me. So we move on to item number 7, updates, and there is none. And so with that, we'll get straight into the meaty part of the meeting with item number 8.1, the RM reform consultation, and hand it over to, I think, Angela.
Thanks. Yes, I'll just get my slideshow up and try and share my screen.
So just while you're doing that, just remind elected members, once Angela's introduced the report, we'll open up for questions. It would be helpful if you could refer to the page that you have a question on, and also a specific point number if there is one, just to help. Obviously, just via Zoom, we don't have the benefit of the more openness around the council table in the actual building. So we can be helpful to staff. That would be great. Over to you, Angela.
Hopefully you can all see my screen. So I'm just going to run through with you today a little bit of information around where the resource management reform has got to, and run past you some key themes that we are proposing to put into our submission on the latest discussion document on the reforms. So I'm just going to start, hopefully, with a little overview of where we're at. Apologies, I know I have given you some of this before, but it was some time ago, so I just want to quickly run through it again. So as you'll likely be aware, the Resource Management Act is being reformed, and they are doing that reform to address 4 key issues that they have identified through the independent expert panel led by the Honourable Tony Randerson QC, and that was published in July 2020. So identified a number of key challenges that our system is facing and that they think it will face in the future. The 4 main issues are up on the slide. So obviously our environment is under pressure, urban areas are struggling to keep pace with growth, we need to reduce carbon emissions and adapt to climate change, and we need to make sure that Māori have an effective role in the system. Now, these 4 issues aren't new. They've been well articulated in previous reviews of the system, both within the government and by the Productivity Commission in 2017 and the Environmental Defence Society in 2019. So what they are proposing at an incredibly high level is to repeal the Resource Management Act and replace it with 3 new acts. So those are the Natural and Built Environments Act, the Strategic Planning Act, and the Climate Adaptation Act. This is a brief overview of where the current timing is at. It's changed somewhat since I spoke to you last. So currently they are consulting on aspects of both the NBA and SPA through the discussion document that was attached to this report. They expect to introduce both bills into Parliament in the second half of 2022. In fact, I think they've said Q3, but yeah, at least at some point in the second half of 2022, and they're expecting to pass it by Parliament by the end of the year, if not in early 2023. The other change is that the Climate Adaptation Act is no longer being progressed on the same timeframe as the other 2 bills that they are working on. So that has kind of stepped out of the package and is happening on a longer timeframe and isn't part of the consultation that we're looking at today. The other thing, hold on, so here's how it sits within the wider local government reform context that we're in at the moment. So as you'll see, the 3 Waters reform is in there, the RMA reform, those timeframes are in as well, and obviously local government reform, the Future for Local Government work is going on at the same time. It's creating a very busy 2022 and 2023 in the reform space, and from 2023 to 4 onwards, there's going to be a lot of implementation. So MFE have said verbally on the RM reform stuff that they expect the implementation of the reform package to take some time. So it may well begin in 2024, but we expect there to be a reasonably long transition period. So here's a diagram. Now, I understand this has been given to you in a PDF, so you can actually zoom in and see it in a more helpful way than what you'll probably get on the screen right now. But I will just run through at a high level what the proposed system looks like, just so you can get a better understanding of what the main changes are that they're proposing. So on the left-hand side of this diagram is the Natural and Built Environments Act. This is the piece of legislation that is largely replacing the RMA in terms of what is currently in there already. So it's including the purpose and related provisions, which is similar to the Part 2 section of the current RMA, which sets out the sort of purpose and matters of significance. And then, apologies, I scrolled when I shouldn't have scrolled. So the MBEA will also elevate major planning decisions to the national and regional levels. So they have a national planning framework, which is somewhat new, so it will we understand that it will consolidate all the existing national direction through national policy statements and national environmental standards and put it into one document. It's also going to include national limits and targets and other provisions such as methods and rules. So we expect to see more direction at a national level through this tool. Flowing down from that, we also have natural and built environments plans. Now, these replace the current district plans and all regional plans and policy statements. These are going to be developed by local government and mana whenua, and they will decisions on these will be made by a joint committee comprising members from local government and mana whenua. So they will we expect they'll be sort of somewhat familiar in terms of district plans and regional plans and what is in them, but the decision-making process around those will change. Those natural and built environments plans will flow on into resource consent decisions and also designations that it shows on there. On the right-hand side of the diagram is the new Strategic Planning Act. So this is new. This doesn't replicate anything that's currently in the RMA. The Act will legislate for regional spatial plans to be developed, and decisions that come out of those regional spatial plans will again be made by a joint committee, this time comprising local government, central government and mana whenua. So this may look somewhat familiar to you for those of you who might have seen things from the Wellington Regional Growth Framework. This is something that we've done on a regional level, which largely replicates what they're proposing here. So it's bringing together all of the planning and infrastructure forecasting for growth and putting it all in one place so that all agencies have a common idea of where things are going, and infrastructure investment and all those sorts of things are more coordinated across government agencies and local government. Apologies. So the other key thing to note on here is the implementation agreements just in the bottom right hand corner linking to central government funding mechanisms. We'll talk a bit more about these later, but it appears that the idea is that implementation agreements will flow out of the regional spatial strategies that will feed into those funding mechanisms and potentially create an obligation for agencies to provide funding for matters that have been agreed through the regional spatial strategy. However, more detail to come on that, I expect. So just moving on in the slides, intentionally this time. So there have been some major changes signalled through the reform program. I'm just going to highlight those here for you. So as I mentioned, plan making decisions will be made by a joint committee for each region, made up of local government and iwi representatives. These decisions are currently made by each individual council under the RMA. Secondly, resource management plans, i.e. the district plan, will no longer be produced at a district level, but will instead be developed at the regional level with local input. Iwi Maori will have a significantly enhanced role in the new resource management system, including in plan making, monitoring and system oversight. Regional spatial strategies will be legislated for through the SPA and created by joint committees. The direction towards spatial planning has already been signalled through the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, but this just creates a clear legislative hook for doing that work. Not so obvious from the discussion on the previous slide is a shift within the system from an effects-based system to an outcome-based system. This is a reasonably technical change and it's a little bit semantics, but what it broadly means is that instead of focusing on managing negative effects of activities, so avoiding remedying and mitigating negative effects, the assessment for consent applications and activities will focus instead on whether the proposed activity is producing the desired positive outcomes as set out in the National Planning Framework and NBEA plan. So this is a shift in the way we think about activities from a negative to a positive frame. You still need to address your negative effects of activities. It just means that consent decision making comes from a starting point of thinking about the benefits of proposed activities in a consent that might have previously been excluded from those considerations. So there is still a lot of important detail that needs to be worked through and that we're waiting to see. So the document talks about a couple of other changes, but doesn't really give us any answers on how they expect those to be implemented. So, three particular areas where there is little detail, but the potential for significant impact on council and our community. Thinking about how the system will provide for local voices as decisions are increasingly moved to a regional or national level, and joint committees are making decisions where our voice is just one of many. We also would like to see more information about what tools will be provided to assist with allocation within limits. And it's also reasonably quiet on how the evidence monitoring and oversight system is being improved to support the quality decision-making processes that they're looking for. So, excuse me, we are unlikely to see any further detail until the draft legislation is introduced into Parliament in the second half of this year. We will be able to submit as part of that select committee process, so we will have a chance to comment on the detail of this stuff as it comes through. But at this point in time, the discussion document is incredibly light on those things, and in some cases is actively seeking feedback on some of those issues, particularly around the inclusion of local voices in the process. So we're in the process of drafting our submission at the moment. It's not due till the end of the month. But we've started shaping it up, and we've got 5 key themes that at this point are looking to shape our submission on the discussion document. Those themes are concerns about the potential loss of local decision making and input, concerns that the system alignment isn't actually going far enough, looking at the need for funding and sector support, providing some comment on the proposed role of Maori in the resource management system, and just noting that a lot of the things that they're seeking to legislate for are actually already possible within the system that we have. So I'm going to work through each of those key themes for you now. As the chair mentioned, if we can hold questions until the end, that would be great, so I can get through all of the issues, and then we can work through them when we get to the end of the presentation. So first off, there are some significant changes in the decision-making proposed in the new system. So notably, there is a significantly greater role for central government in decision-making within the system. So the introduction of the national planning framework will likely result in a larger number of issues being resolved at the national level. This isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Councils have been asking for greater direction from central government for some time to step in and resolve specific contentious issues, including natural hazards and climate change. So it's expensive and time consuming for councils to have to address all of those individually rather than having some clear direction from the national level, and it can often lead to inconsistency and suboptimal outcomes across the country. So however, and this is a continuation of the role that central government already plays in the RM system when they release national policy statements and environmental standards, although potentially with a slightly expanded scope. There is also a new role for central government at a regional level, in the way that they are putting central government in the decision-making committees for the regional spatial plan. So up to this point, there's been a very limited role for central government in this level of plan making. They have, I guess, sometimes been a submitter on regional plans, but they haven't had any real role in decision making for the vast majority of councils in this space. So this is a clear expansion of central government scope and resource management decision making. So the joint committee structure and shifting decision making on plans to the regional level is likely to leave a lack of clarity about the role of territorial authorities in the new system. While we're likely but not guaranteed to have representation on the joint committees that make decisions on plans and spatial strategies, there is little indication of how we will be able to influence and engage in the system, both at the officer and political level. So the way this structure settles in practice will have a huge impact on the level of influence that council can have on decisions that will have potentially significant impacts on our community, and that council will have a role in implementing. it's important for us to have flexibility built into our resource management system. So not all issues are most effectively dealt with at the national or regional level. We need to have enough agility in the system to allow issues to be resolved at the scale that makes most sense. And sometimes that will be a local scale. The proposed system appears to be forcing the majority of issues into that regional box, unless it is dealt with at a national scale. This creates a less agile system, and there are significant risks of poor local outcomes if there aren't sufficient mechanisms for local input and variation in place. Collectively, these changes raise a real concern about the ability of local communities to be heard and to have decisions made by people that understand and represent their communities. Our voice and unique experience risks getting drowned out by the collective voices of the wider Wellington region. As a community that has close ties over its border to the north, our ability to influence across borders may also be constrained under this new arrangement, with so many other voices at the table fighting to be heard. Importantly, the discussion document is seeking feedback on how to include local voices in this process, and we will ensure that we provide substantial feedback on this aspect of the proposal. And keen to hear your guys' thoughts at the end of this about how you see possible ways that you could see that happening. The second theme is that system alignment isn't going far enough. So the regional spatial strategies are set to identify how a region will grow over the next 30 years and seeks to integrate decisions on land use, urban development and infrastructure and environmental protection to ensure that all stakeholders are working towards a common set of goals. Some synchronising of timeframes is proposed in the discussion document. So spatial strategy and national planning framework reviews are set to occur on the same 9-year cycle. Timeframes for individual NBEA plan reviews isn't yet clear. However, currently district plans have a 10-year review cycle, so we can probably expect that it's reasonably going to line up with what they have already. But what isn't clear is the extent to which the spatial strategy is going to link with other central government planning and funding mechanisms, including national and regional transport plans and their associated funding, and how this proposal will link with the new water entities for Three Water and the Three Water Reform Programme. So as you're aware, local government infrastructure funding is undertaken through LTPs on a 3-yearly cycle and annual plans every year. Under this new system, councils may have less discretion about how they spend their infrastructure funds if things are locked in by a regional spatial strategy, which requires delivery on infrastructure within specified timeframes. It might limit flexibility to adjust infrastructure programs to meet changing local needs as we work through our long-term plan. The discussion document has asked to what extent the implementation agreements that are linked to the spatial strategy should be binding on participants. It appears that these agreements are intended to lock in central government funding required to support growth as outlined in the RSS, but it may also do the same for local government. It's not clear. While this would certainly provide more certainty for local government over what funding would be received over the duration of the spatial strategy from central government for infrastructure projects, this could in theory be a good thing for council. We can commit to funding our share of the infrastructure knowing that the central government is definitely going to provide the roads, schools and public transport services needed to support the growth that will be that will be forthcoming. But on a practical level, it's really unclear how that could be managed. The spatial strategies will be alive over 3 electoral cycles. Priorities can and will change, costs will go up, and the government is going to need to manage those changes. So its ability to clearly commit to projects 9 years in the future and to be able to guarantee they'll be able to give enough money to support those projects when they come around is a practical question. And while it is a problem for government, not us, I guess we have to be aware that we may be asked to stump up the difference if costs escalate and what will happen if things get delayed. The other risk is that government will seek to minimise that risk by only agreeing to a small number of infrastructure projects through the regional spatial strategies as a way of reducing the drain on their future budgets. And that would have a really limiting effect on the spatial strategies and prevent them from supporting the transformational visions for growth that regions might be seeking to that they might be seeking to enact. So certainty is good, but it has to be able to provide for course correction when circumstances change. Our district looks hugely different to how it looked 10 years ago, and we wouldn't necessarily have predicted it would grow in the ways that it did. We now have an expressway through the middle of our district, which has fundamentally changed the way our communities move and how we've grown. There's no reason to believe that we wouldn't experience a similar step change over the next decade. And we need to be able to course correct to make sure that our plans can take into account future change. The risk is that the regional spatial strategy may just be creating an extra level of complexity in the system, making it more rigid and less able to respond in a dynamic way. So funding and sector support. This one will be a little bit shorter. The details on how they are planning to fund and the implementation of the system and what support will be available is very limited in the discussion document. Will there be funding for implementation? This is a key part of our submission, is that central government should be funding the implementation of the reform package and the implementation of the national planning framework and national direction. As an example of why that's important, the implementation of the national policy statement urban development over the last maybe 5 years has had an enormous cost for councils, requiring dedicated resources, external consultants and huge reporting burdens. And all of this was expected to be undertaken without additional funding to support it. And this is repeated over and over again with each piece of national direction that is rolled out by central government, and creates the unfunded mandate that is handed to local government over time. So we intend on having reasonably strong commentary in our submission on this point. The other questions that we are asking is what the proposed cost share is for the spatial strategies, who's funding the joint committees and providing the secretariat support, what, if any, new funding streams are being proposed, and are they proposing changes to the current user pays model that is the standard for resource management in New Zealand. So the Local Government Act already provides a framework for deciding fees and charges, which we have to work through our annual plans. So it's unclear why we're replicating some of those, some of that charging framework under the NBA. It's also going to be really important for training and professional development for staff, so that they understand and can appropriately implement the reform program. We would like to see that funded and provided by, well, funded centrally and potentially provided by appropriate professionals, or are councils expected to do that upskilling and training themselves? So as I said, our submission on these points will be pointing out that detail is required and making it clear that we see a significant contribution from government to support the implementation of these reforms and to make sure it's successful. It's also important to note that the Future for Local Government is looking at funding of the sector more broadly, and so while that's out of scope, so that's out of scope of the submission, but it obviously still has some clear linkages. So we will be focusing on funding specifically for the implementation of the reform program in the system, rather than the wider concept of local government funding. The role of Maori in resource management is another one of the themes. So quite a large chunk of the discussion document was dedicated to discussing the enhanced role for Maori in the resource management system, from decision making on plans and the NPF through to indicating a greater role in monitoring and reporting. This increased role for iwi is a really good thing, and it will make some really positive changes in the resource management system. However, they're going to need support from central government to be able to step into a role of the size that they're proposing, particularly our iwi who have not concluded their treaty settlement processes. Despite best efforts, iwis have found it challenging to engage in consultation processes across their rohe. They are often drowning in consultation documents, plan changes, consents from multiple councils with little resourcing to support it. these are real practical concerns, and we will highlight them. However, importantly, we are seeking input from our iwi on this part of our submission, and we expect the final comments in this section will heavily reflect their positions. But those are kind of the key themes in that space as we see it. Finally, some of these things are possible already. So councils all have high workloads across resource management functions. We manage plan reviews, we are dealing with increasing consent volumes, and we are responding to and implementing national direction. So naturally, we have to seek efficiencies in the way we work as our workload increases with every change in the RMA or introduction of new national direction. The only way that we manage this is to work smarter, and we have been pulling together with like-minded councils. We have just a few examples of the way we have joined forces to collaborate on issues where there is common ground. We have developed common plan content, particularly for natural hazards in the Wellington region. We have collaborated on the implementation of national direction, particularly the NPSUD and the reporting that goes alongside that. We have jointly submitted on issues, including the previous consultation on the RM reform process. And we have created a regional leadership committee, which is responsible for the implementation of the Wellington Regional Growth Framework. So we're already working in that space. We certainly aren't looking to localise issues where there's no benefit from doing that. And we often look beyond our immediate boundaries and our region, seeking councils with similar issues and experiences. But working together isn't a perfect fix. Already that creates a tension between working regionally and maintaining local variety when we need it. And we need to make sure that where we do work together, our local voice is heard. So yes, there are efficiency gains to be had, but there's nuance that can be really hard to legislate for. We can already work together, so in some ways legislating for it just makes the system less flexible. So that brings me to the end of my slides. So yeah, we're looking for feedback on the themes that we've raised here, whether you feel like they are on the right track, whether there's any other matters you'd like to see included. Submissions are due at the end of the month. So what we're proposing to do from here is to finalise a submission and then get it signed off through a subgroup, including the Mayor, several councillors and the Chief Executive, just so we can get it through the hoops to get out the door in time at the end of February. So I will potentially leave my slides up just in case we want to refer back to them and open it up for questions. Does that work for you, Chair?
Thank you, Angela. Yep, that's absolutely fine. And I think you've covered the topics within the paper really well. However, there may be questions from elected members, so I will just see whether we have any hands up, just reminding you to use the reactions and pop your hands up if you have a question. Councillor Compton's the first one that I've seen. So if open up to you, Councillor.
Thank you. That through the chair, I think that was a really helpful presentation. I guess my question is that given what's essentially being developed under these reforms, what you could argue are regional unitary plans, and what's being proposed in this new framework is putting another layer of bureaucracy on top of existing governance structures. So you'll have your local council, you have your regional council, then you'll have your joint committee on top of that. So you're effectively getting what boils down to being a three-tier system of local government. I guess my question is, what consideration is likely to be given in our submission around actually just biting the bullet and opting for a single regional authority that's going to have clearer lines of accountability? It's going to remove that, I guess, the sort of infighting that we have between councils that we've seen over the years. I mean, we talk about councils have the ability to cooperate on stuff. It begs the question why we haven't actually done much of that over 30 years, and there is the tensions between us. And it's also that sort of thing would actually lead to the system alignment that we're talking about elsewhere in the paper. So I'm curious to know what sort of consideration is going to be given to that.
So maybe I start off answering that, and Angela can add anything else. So in the discussion document, they're very clear that there not looking at any structural change through these reforms. They're very much trying to draw a line and leave that to the future for local government reform. So we've tried to, despite the obvious, as you point out, the obvious structural issues that are being raised through what they're aiming to do here, we've tried to veer away from commenting too much into that space, because I suspect it's not going to be necessarily picked up through the submission process.
Yeah, I guess I appreciate why the government's trying to deal with these things separately. I just think
it's artificial.
Yeah, and I think we should address it in this when we do this, because it's a silly paper wall from the government's perspective, and we should just say, look, you can't reform that. I mean, you're going to have to reform this again, but depending on what comes out of the future of local government review, what comes out of the Three Waters review, because it's the whole the raison d'etre of local government is spatial and natural resource planning. So where that point of decision making ends up is where actually your point of where you should be electing your representatives to, and where that point of accountability should be created, because that everything else we do feeds down from those plans. And I guess that's the point I'm getting to, is that the government has to actually, they can't just try and treat this in isolation with the existing structures. They actually do need to think about the fundamental overarching structure, and then this feeds into what the future of local government review does.
Yeah, it's looking in some ways it would. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
In some ways, I'm just mindful we're in question time, and I let that go a little bit, Councillor, but I've just got to be mindful of everyone else. Feel free to respond if you need to, Natasha. I just want to check with Councillor Compton if he had a further question, and if not, after that, I'll go to Councillor McCann.
No, nothing else from me.
Thanks, Gwen. Natasha, did you want to add anything further?
No, that's okay.
Thank you. Councillor McCann, you're up next, and then Councillor Hanford, then Holborough.
Thanks, Angela. That was an excellent presentation. Could I ask you to just elaborate on your comments around what this might mean for a district plan? Then I've got a further question.
So there will no longer be a district plan. Our district plan content will be rolled up into what will become a regional national built environment plan. What we don't understand yet is exactly how that process will occur. So it may well be that, at least initially, they take all of our plans and staple them together and say, here is a single document. Or there could be a more involved process that looks to create a more cohesive single plan with shorter sections where there's local variation. So that is really unclear, and it is possibly something that will be left up to the regional joint committees to decide how they go about that process. Some of those sort of transitional arrangements haven't really been nutted out, but there's certainly different ways that could occur. We wouldn't expect to see all the content of the district plan thrown out and then starting from scratch. There'll be, I would expect to see it largely, at least initially, largely transitioned into the new plan in one way or another. But there will be no district plan. It will just be the Regional National Built Environment Act plan.
So are we specifically going to raise what the negative outcomes of that could be? I think you've illustrated some of those negative outcomes there, like stapling them all together and calling it a big plan. Is that part of our submission?
Yes, it can well be. And I think the main concern we have in there, and it kind of relates to how it all happens, is the loss of local variation. So if it does end up to staple it all together and call it a single plan, there's still lots of local variation in there. So everyone will still have the plan content. So there's pluses and minuses, however that kind of plays out. But we can certainly try and talk to some of that efficiency, but we'll certainly be talking to the need to ensure that through the process and trying to create as much consistency across the plan as possible, we still need to have space for that local variation where that is really important to us.
The other concern I have, and that's the final question, Mr. Chair, is around consultation. Are we referring in the document to the potential loss of consultation at a community level?
I suspect so. Strictly speaking, the answer is probably no. So people will still have the same opportunities to submit on processes. However, it's likely to feel a lot harder when you're submitting on a part of a bigger regional beast than on your, I mean, our own district plan is hard enough for people to submit on and understand as it stands on its own, let alone once you bundle it up with a whole bunch of things that apply across the region. So while there will still be the same, I would expect to see the same consultation processes as part of plan making, the decision-making part of that is now more removed. So as it currently stands, you guys as the district council have the final sign-off on plan changes. It goes through a process, it comes to council, and you give the final sign-off on what happens. Under this proposed new system, that no longer happens. It goes to the regional joint committee, and the final sign-off happens there. So, and in that committee, we're just one of many voices. So, yeah.
Thanks, Angela. Just before I move to Councillor Hanford, building on the question from Councillor McCann, is a good example. I was trying to think of examples that we've got live at the moment that can kind of relate to what's happening here. The mandatory upscaling for the national policy statement around urban development. So, for example, the intensification around those smaller community town centres. I mean, using Otaki as an example, that's the that losing that local voice and local decision making when it's been made at in this case, a national level, but even a regional level. Is that a reasonable example?
Yeah, I think that does show the general difficulties of making sure that in the push for consistency, it's really hard to get those local differences considered when it's significant for us in our communities, but on a regional scale, the decision makers might decide that it's not significant enough, and our voice isn't strong enough to be able to get that over the line. So yeah, it's a good analogue for what we can probably expect to see played out in some of those decisions.
Thank you. And so maybe we could reference that example. And I've got another one in our submission. Sean, if you're available, again, before I move to Councillor Hanford, the other example I thought was sitting on the Regional Transport Committee I think is probably a good example of all those councils together trying to agree on a regional plan. And as others have just mentioned earlier in this meeting, potentially trying to get all councils to agree, on funding for areas and other councils. Is that another example we could reference where you've got all those councils? Arguably, we work together, but there is debate over, where the funding goes, and from a transport perspective, whose roads get prioritised and so forth.
I think that would possibly be also. I mean, Let's Get Wellington Moving, I guess, is maybe a good example of where a significant amount of funding is going to a project where some might argue that there are fewer benefits for some of the outer councils like ourselves, and more benefit for Wellington centric in terms of that project. So yeah, that would be a good example to reference as well.
Excellent, thanks, Sean. I'm going to move to Councillor Hanford.
Oh, Morena, thank you, Angela. I found that really, really useful. I'm just wondering, you mentioned kind of a couple of technical changes in there too, just around the focus on moving the focus from kind of mitigating the bad to focusing on enhancing and aspiring for positive outcomes. And I wonder if there's space within our submission too to kind of touch on the outcomes that we really think could be quite positive through this as well. I know this is a point that I raised through our feedback to the Three Waters reform work as well, just kind of making sure too that we keep those outcomes at the centre of this as well, and making sure that, if we think that this will give iwi Māori a better opportunity to feed in and enhance or give better recognition to principles of society, that we say, yep, we really support that, but we maybe think that there are ways that we need to continue enabling that to happen better, and maybe there are ways that this can be tweaked to ensure that happens. So I'm just wondering if we could kind of take some of what you said too, Angela, about the changes that are happening through kind of refocusing on not just mitigating the bad, to then also feed that through our submission to actually go, yeah, these are the outcomes that we really support. Like, for example, better enabling development within natural environmental limits. Like, yes, that's really important. And so making sure that those come through really strongly, I think, if that's doable.
Yep, we can definitely do that.
Cool, thank you. And the other question I had, and I'm not sure how relevant it is specifically to this, considering this is just about consultation, but how we ensure that iwi within Kapiti are kind of ready and have capacity to also feed into the consultation, because yeah, I'm aware that, you know, we've got, although staff time is pretty pressed, but we do have the resource to kind of dig deep into the consultation and to understand what's in front of us right now to a degree, or to a very good degree. So I'm just wondering kind of what iwi's, what we know of iwi's capacity right now to be understanding all of this and to be up with the play to then feed into the consultation, or if there's work that we can do as council to kind of support them.
So we've started those conversations with our iwi to make sure that in the first instance that our submission in itself reflects what they expect their experience to be of these changes, to make sure that we are supporting their voice. I also expect that at least some of our iwi will be submitting in their own right. So on the last round of the reforms where we had an exposure draft, I think at least 2 of our iwi submitted as themselves on that process, and they've shared those thoughts with me to help shape up what we're going to put in our submission. I also understand that that there is some representation from among our iwi on basically a focus group that the ministry has set up to try and inform the changes that that they're proposing in the roles and responsibilities space of this Act. So I mean, you're right, it absolutely does come down to resourcing and how they're able to engage in that system, but it seems at the moment that they certainly have an intent, and there's some different sort of points that they can be involved in, but we'll certainly be working with them over the rest of the month to make sure that we can support them in their thinking and make sure that we can line up our submissions and support each other in that process as best we can.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. Those are my questions. Cheers.
Awesome. And thank you, Sophie. Look, and just agree with the point that Sophie's making around supporting the outcomes, but I just want to put a caveat. When you're thinking about writing that submission, it is dependent on the supporting action. So, for example, the enhanced involvement of Maori is important, but if they don't also take our other recommendation around adequately resourcing them, then it's kind of nullified. And I think Three Waters as well, where we raised points in our submission around Three Waters, we supported many of the outcomes, but then what we've seen is them not adopting those other actions to support the actual fulfillment of those outcomes at a local level. So, I think we do need to raise the points that Councillor Hanford has suggested. I think they're good points, but they are subject to those other things being, kind of delivered to enable that to happen. Councillor Holborough, or Deputy Mayor Holborough.
Yes, kia ora tātou. Thank you, James. So I've got some questions, but some of them might turn a little bit into comments, but I'm keen to make them now while staff have a chance to respond, if that, with your leave, Mr. Chair. So I was going to ask the same question about iwi, kind of where they're at with their submissions, because this is hugely important, not just in terms of capacity for iwi locally, but also for the complexity around these regional entities in terms of the number of iwi that are going to need to feed in to those larger spatial plans. So are we making that point around that as well as the capacity issue?
Just before you respond to Angela, and I know I'm labouring the point, but many of the councillors that went to the hui in Wellington around the Three Waters will remember this question was raised to them, and we were reassured that our local iwi would be involved. And I guess that's partly the point that I'm making. That's not so much what I heard from them over the last 12 to 18 months. So over to you, Angela.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question part of that for me?
So are we making the point that there'll be a huge amount of complexity with multiple iwi dealing with each of these regional plans?
Yeah, for sure. So it's definitely for one of the issues on the joint committees is representation and what that will look like. So it appears that is going to be decided at a region. The makeup of those committees will be decided at a regional level, but there's no guarantee that all iwi within the region will be represented on that committee, which is an issue in and of itself. And the same goes for councils. There's no guarantee that all councils will be represented on all committees either. So some of that side of things is still to be determined, but there is certainly a huge amount of complexity for the people creating the plans to make sure that it encompasses all of those viewpoints. And there's also a huge amount of complexity and workload for iwi, who often will have multiple regions that intersect with their rohe, and they'll have potentially, you know, 3 or 4 regional, enormous regional plans that they're going to have to try and adequately give time consideration to and be part of those processes. So there's definitely the sheer numbers of players creates complexity on both sides of that equation, I think, and we can definitely reflect that in our submission.
Fantastic. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is in terms of the regional entities, could you just remind us, because sometimes there's a little bit of a confusion with the Wellington region or regional entities, and then they don't encompass the same kind of area. So could you just remind us what kind of area of region would we be dealing with here? So
it is expected that the regions will reflect the regional council boundaries. So that kind of encompasses what we'd expect to see from that. And I would imagine that means that Hurawhenua would be excluded from that, despite in our Wellington Regional Growth Framework Leadership Committee, they are included in that committee. So it is a bit unclear how those lines will be drawn and whether there will be flexibility to include partner councils from outside the region to make it make more sense. Yeah, so that's unclear. The other thing to note is that the committees that make decisions on the NBEA plans are not necessarily the same committees that make decisions on the spatial strategy. So they potentially have different membership, and central government is only involved in the spatial strategies one and not in the NBEA plans one. So it is complicated. There is different membership, but as far as I can tell at this point, it seems intended that they will reflect the regional council area. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. And I think that just highlights the kind of potentially added complexity that's happening when the whole purpose of this was to reduce complexity. So I think that's a point that we couldn't labour enough in our submission. And I just wanted to add into that kind of was what Councillor Compton was talking about in terms of the siloed approaches. Even though we know they're consulting on these separately, we're still making a comment around our concern around the different pieces of work that are happening and how they align and intersect and integrate with each other.
Yeah, sure.
And I just wanted to go back to what Councillor McCann was talking about too with the local input. And I think we can make a really strong point that it's going to be not just a little bit harder, but a lot harder for individuals, for communities, for stakeholder groups to have a meaningful role in these larger entities. Having sat on some of those some resource consent hearings and plan change hearings, I know how that local voice is really important, and I'm sure the team are aware of that as well. So I think that's a point that we could really make quite strongly as well.
Yeah, for sure.
That's the end of my questions. Thanks very much. It's excellent work.
Thanks.
Very good. Councillor Halliday.
Marina, Angela, and just echoing Deputy Mayor Holborough's views. This is an excellent report, and the information coming through has been superb. I just wanted to support the views of the other councillors and everything they've said so far. And I just want a little bit of clarity about one thing, which we've been talking about pushing up to the regional side of things and the strengthening around that. But I'm just curious, do you think there's an outcome here from a local perspective with regards to our local outcome documents? If we're looking to try to feed into that regional voice, the strength of our local outcome documents is going to be very, very important moving forward. and those perhaps being combined with iwi mana whenua as such?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The way it's a really good way that we can potentially feed into those processes if we have those documents that are prepared and have those kind of local outcomes and their intentions in place. One of the things that I think was mentioned somewhere in the discussion document was the possibility of the likes of town centre plans and things to make it and to be pushed up into that into those regional planning documents. But there's no reason why we other local outcome type documents couldn't have that same impact. So we can definitely reflect that as a potential way of making sure that local voices are heard in those processes.
Cool, thank you. And I think the 5 points you looked at there are good key points after reading all the information you put out there as well. But the strength around, I don't know, it just seems a little bit more centralisation than anything else, rather than local looking after local. And I think that local voice is very, very important. And how do we see that being see that coming through this whole process? I think it's going to be a real challenge. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Elliott and then Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you. Can you see me? First question.
I can, and I can hear the crickets are alive and well. And
they are. They certainly are. They've been going since about 7.
Cicadas.
Cicadas. Yep. Thank you, Angela, for a really, really good submission. I think it does reflect our views. As we move forward into this process and it becomes enacted and enabled, is there still the option still available to us as a council to consider an application to the Local Government Commission for a boundary change to move our district or part of our district into the Hora Whenua if we find that those natural synergies are lined up far more with Hora Whenua than the horizons than Wellington?
As Natasha said earlier, this doesn't really go into sort of boundary issues, but that said, I wouldn't imagine there's anything that would prevent council from doing that if that was something they wanted to do in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackie. Councillor Pravanov, welcome to the meeting. Good that you could make it.
Thank you, James. Yes, solid apologies for not being able to attend earlier. And I may well have missed some of the good conversation that I've been listening to recently. So by actually moving this to a regional level, what is going to happen to all the resource consenting that this council does, all those types of activities that this council does?
So my understanding is that resource consenting will still be undertaken by the local councils. So we'll still be implementing the plans. It's just the plan development will occur across a regional level. It's unclear what that part of it looks like. So how they will bring together the various expertise from around the region to create that plan. Whether that's, it's unclear if there's any kind of structural change that would enable that to happen, or whether it will just be sort of a collaborative approach using staff as they are. So that's kind of the main change. But in terms of the resource consenting and indeed at this stage the monitoring and enforcement, those functions still appear to sit with local councils. The one caveat around that is the discussion document mentions that there had been a suggestion to move the monitoring and enforcement function to regional clusters, but they haven't made, there are no clear recommendations on that front in this discussion document. So at this point, it appears that it's going to remain the status quo for now, at least.
Thank you, Angela, for that. Sorry, there's a squawking thing outside as well here. But my other question then, so it's good that that is going to occur, but my question, follow-on from question that local decision making going to be made on what we know as our current district plan, or would they be made on the regional plan or the more regional plan when it's actually developed? So, basically, what are the, where are the rules and regulations coming from? Are they still going to be local, or are they going to be more covering a wider area?
No, they will become regional. So the current district plan expires until at such time that it's replaced with an NDEA plan. And once that's in place, then all of the rules and other methods that govern our resource management in our region will come out of that plan. There may well be rules that have regional variation that create separate rules for places in our district, but all of that will be housed within the regional NDEA plan.
Thank you. That's a big change, isn't it?
Thank you, Councillor Pravanov. And look, I referred to the intensification impact on Otaki, but equally the Waikanae Beach community was raised as well. So that's, you know, possibly an area that Councillor Pravanov is concerned about as well, around these regional plans, as I'm sure there are other areas within the district. I don't see any other hands up by elected members. So if you, I don't think there is anyone else. So with that, we've had a really good go at it. Angela, is there anything further you want to add before we move to the recommendations?
No, I think that's all fine.
Okay, team. So we've got the recommendations on page 6 of the digital report, from A through to D, noting that the final submission, once it's completed by staff, will be in consultation with the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and myself and the Chair of Strategy and Ops. Do we have anyone that wants to move the recommendations? See Councillor Holborough and a seconder. Seconded by Councillor Hanford. So with that, I'm going to move into right of introduction from Councillor Holborough.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we've had actually quite a good discussion through our question time. I'd just like to thank the staff for this hugely important piece of work. This is a massive change that's coming our way, and amongst many changes, as Councillor Compton rightly pointed out, and a huge amount of work for our staff to get their heads around and respond to all that's going on. So just thank you for the report, and it's my pleasure to move it.
Thank you. If you could just pop your hands up if you've got anything to say via debate. I've got something further I'll add, but I'll just see whether there's any. I can't see any other hands up. So look, just following on from what I said earlier.
Mr. Chair, Councillor Halliday has his hand up.
Okay. Martin, over to you, and then I'll wrap up when.
Look, just very, very briefly, I just wanted to reiterate the fact this is moving away from local input. I think it's really, really important that we do make sure that we'll try to fight for that local voice and our voice as local government. And this, I think, yeah, I agree with Deputy Mayor Holborough. This is a excellent piece of work and a lot of work there for staff. But I just wanted to bring that up. Also, just wanted to ask. I'm sorry, it's not a question to staff, but the report that or the submission that is being submitted, is being put together on our behalf as council. So we see that before. You guys submit that into government as such? Perhaps you can answer that, Councillor Coates. I'm just wondering whether where's the rest of the council table, we just get to see that document before it's fired off.
I'll check with staff first, Martin. I know that it goes into the EMB, but I'm not too sure in terms of the process around whether a draft gets circulated. I think that's the point of having a working group. Otherwise, I
wasn't interested in a draft. It was just more like have a read of it before it goes through. I mean, I'm quite happy with the process that's going through with regards to all this.
So my recollection of that is normally it goes through the EMB, the final version that's submitted. So if staff want to add anything else, that's fine. Otherwise, yeah, expect to see it in the EMB, elected members bulletin.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see any other hands up. So look, I think as Councillor Hanford said, most of us support the outcomes that are trying to be achieved in many of these approaches. The challenge for me is whether the advertisement on the box matches what's inside. And our experience with the Three Waters, as I said to you earlier, many of you, I remember seeing you sitting alongside me down at the workshops in Wellington, along with other councils. Many of the things we were told would be listened to and acted on, and some of those things we're not necessarily seeing coming to fruition. So there are some concerns out of this, and I think as staff have pointed out, there are other ways to achieve this with what we have existing. And I think as many of you have said, essentially it is at risk of removing the local out of local government and that local sort of views and representation. So with that, I'm just going to go back to Councillor Holbrook, who does have the right of reply. That's just my views via debate, and see whether Janet wants to have a right of reply, and then we'll put that to the vote.
No, well said, Councillor Coots. I'll waive my right of reply.
All right, thank you, Janet. So I'm going to put that to the vote. Just use your reaction tab. Remember, green tick for yes, red one for no, and then the arrow if you want to abstain. So all those in favour and those against. Just allow a few seconds. If DEM services can just let me know when you've got it recorded.
We have 9 yeses, and we don't have any no's. Major Sneeze, yes, 9 yeses.
Excellent, thank you. That is passed. And so we'll now...
If everybody could also just now remove their ticks before you move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. All right, team, we've had a good crack at that, and it's 20 to 11. I was looking at having a wee break so that you don't get exhausted. The next pieces are reasonably big item as well. So I think we will move on to that and then look at taking a break after the next item. So that's item 8.2 in the agenda, found on page 66. And Angela, thanks for walking us through that previous report. So we're just handing over to Jason now, who's going to walk us through the proposed plan changes. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good morning to elected members. I will also just mention that I have Laura Willoughby with me today, and she's going to be the second part of a 2-part act. I'll give a brief overview and then hand across to Laura. Yeah, I guess I should really start with a bit of a segue from the item that just preceded this one. It's interesting to follow an item which is talking about a world where we don't have district planning in the same way that we have now, and it may well lead some councillors to perhaps wonder, you know, why do we bother in the interim? The answer, I think, is a pretty easy one. It is our opportunity to ensure that that local voice is provided, and we're going to have a district plan that lives on for quite some time before whatever the new world looks like is sort of congeals itself. So it certainly is worth continuing on with improving the district plan, and in fact we have an obligation as council to do so in the interim. So the matter that we have in front of you today relating to the district plan covers 3 omnibus topics. Now, you may recall back on the 21st of October last year, we came to you with a number of topics that we were recommending we do further investigation on and further consultation on. 3 of those are now ready for you to endorse and move on to the next stage of the plan making process. And so the decision that we are going to be seeking from you today really is about initiating the formal RMA process in which people will have a further opportunity to have their say on the merits of each of these plan changes. That's what public notification is. It's not council saying that the final form of these plan changes is sort of ready to go, if you like. It's more saying that these topics are ready for, there's been enough work done, the provisions are ready, the Section 32 evaluation is ready. Let's take that next step, let's take that out to the public and see what they have to say. And so a decision to endorse these topics for public notification today will initiate a public notice that will start a 20 working day submission period in which people will have that chance to have their say. So it's a really important thing to to sort of get your head around is the purpose of the decision that we're seeking today. Yeah, I think perhaps at this point I might hand over to Laura to talk a bit more about each of these topics.
Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Jason, and Morena Chair and elected members. It's good to be here today. As Jason has kindly introduced the topics, you will remember that on the committee meeting on October last year, we brought a whole range of alphabet soup to you for plan changes, and these are the first three that we now believe are ready to go out for public notification. And the reason we believe they're ready are probably threefold. So firstly, we have now had the time and opportunity to have an independent planning consultant undertake an evaluation report on them, where she's looked at the options and evaluated them and come up with the conclusion that the plan changes are the best option in terms of providing an efficient and effective plan. Secondly, we've now had time to do some more consultation on the draft provisions, and that has been quite a process. It's taken a few months towards the end of last year, so we have sent a copy to the Minister for the Environment. We have spoken to all our neighbouring councils, and as far as Wellington City Council as well, and made them aware that these plan changes we're drafting. We've also spoken to mana whenua in person, via email, and discussed the topics with them directly. And we've also put some information out on websites, notified the community, had a 3-week period where we invited comments and approached some planning consultancies in the area directly for feedback. So yeah, it's been quite a process. We got some good feedback on them, some good pointers around improving some of the wording, particularly around for the cycle parking one. So I'll run through what they are first. Plan change 1A is obviously the accessible parking provisions, where we're looking to introduce new provisions in the district plan to maintain a level of accessible parking provision. Plan change 1B, we're looking to remove some provisions in the district plan around liquefaction risk, mainly because that's now covered by the building code for new buildings. And plan change 1C is new provisions around the cycle parking. So increasing the provisions that we had before. And yeah, so the feedback was really good, really helpful. Everybody was generally in support of the plan changes. Some suggestions that have helped to improve the drafting, which have been adopted, and some feedback asking for the plan provisions to go a bit further than we anticipated. These are mainly to do with the accessible parking provisions and thinking about how this may go in the future with electric vehicles, and whether or not there should be a provision for power cabling or charging devices to be installed. And also with the cycle parking plan change, whether it should go further than what we were proposing and to include micro mobility devices as well. So we thought about those, definitely did. And I think at this time, we didn't feel like we had the evidence and data to support those. Mainly, and also very mindful of the fact that on our district plan work program, in 2 years' time, there will be a transport plan change, where I think we'll be in a better position to have some more national guidance around these issues, and also a bit more data potentially to inform a plan change in the transport space that could cover them off. Because we're very mindful that particularly the accessible parking provision, we were looking to just maintain a consistent level of service, given that we were having to remove our minimum car parking standards. So the third reason why we think we're ready, we also took the time to submit an application to the Environment Court to request that when plan change 1A, the accessible parking plan change, was publicly notified and asked for submissions, that it had some legal effect. And the reason for this is because the National Policy Statement on Urban Development requires us to remove our minimum car parking standards, and that has to occur before the 20th of February. So we are looking to notify that plan change on the 17th of February because we don't want there to be a gap. And I think the way that the previous calculations for accessible parking were calculated meant that they relied on a certain level of minimum car parking for the calculation to work. And so what we've done is realize that if we drop that middle calculation, that we can now directly just link floor area or staff numbers directly to accessible parking provision. So the Environment Court accepted that argument and released a decision to say that they agreed that Plan Change 1A, the accessible parking provisions, could have or should have legal effect from the date of notification. So that means there will still be some provision for accessible parking, we hope consistently, through the transition phase where we do remove the general minimum car parking standards. So yes, again, the date that we're looking to publicly notify is 17th of February, on or around this year. And yeah, we believe that these 3 plan changes are ready.
Thank you. And I'm sure elected members have read their paper, but that decision from the Environment Court is attached as well, showing the support for Council's approach. Jason, just back to you to wrap up. Have you got anything further you want to add? Also noting that elected members have canvassed some questions offline via email with staff. And so you're welcome to still raise them if you feel they're relevant from a public view perspective. But just back to Jason to see if there's anything he wants to add. Otherwise, we'll move into questions.
No, nothing really, Councillor. The electric vehicle charging issue that was raised in one of the matters of feedback, I think it was from Greater Wellington, is certainly one, as Laura said, it's not that we don't believe it has merit to look at. It's more that when it does get looked at, it needs to be looked at well. The work needs to be done, the evidence needs to be gathered, and rushing these things in a planning context never leads to a good outcome. So I guess what we're signalling there is let's keep it on the radar, and let's look to incorporate work on that in a future plan change.
Excellent, thank you. And so team, the recommendations are on page 66 and 67. I'm just going to open it up for questions. Pop your hand up. I think Councillor McCann, you'd indicated that you'd have a couple of questions. I see whether there's anyone else. I can't see any on the screen at the moment that have questions. Councillor Halliday, sorry?
I was just going to clarify my questions have been answered via email.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Halliday, I see you're up first, Councillor Elliott, and then Councillor Pravanov.
Yeah, look, thank you, Jason. And look, thanks for the clarity at the beginning of this as well, regards the purpose of today, because I did have a few questions, but even that short summary that you did actually covered a heck of a lot of them off. One of the concerns I've got is around the amount of the formulas used for the amount of cycling. Are we talking about all 3 of these, or we're just talking about the one as such? It's all 3, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the formulas that allowed for cycling parks, say in building spaces, seem to be quite light. To me, would that be something that would be revisited, or is that something that through the submission process will be considered around this? So
there certainly is an opportunity, Councillor, for those who believe greater provision is required to make that point clear in a formal submission. And by creating that scope to look at it, then the hearings panel would be able to evaluate the merits of that. So in regards to that, one of the things I didn't really see covered too much in this is retirement homes and the requirement for accessible parking in retirement homes as such. I noticed there's a lot of different categories for different things, but one of the comments that's come back to me from people in retirement villages has been around the building code really working towards just the average person rather than elderly people. Of course, something like a retirement village might have more of a requirement for accessible parking, especially in multi-unit environments where their way to get around is by a car. They need, they don't necessarily have the ability to walk long distances as such. Do you know if there's been any allowance or any thought around retirement villages specifically in this sort of conversation? Laura, do you have any more detailed recollection of that?
Not specific conversations around that, but I believe with the standards that are proposed, it would be potentially caught by, depending on what type of retirement living it is proposed, could be supported living accommodation, or else if it may be caught by the new multi-unit residential sort of standards, which would require. So it would depend exactly what the type of retirement village that was proposed.
I hear what you're saying. It's just that the multi-unit's fairly ambiguous with regards to the designation of what that environment is as such, whereas a retirement environment is quite specific, would potentially have quite a higher need as such. But look, perhaps I can just get some people to nudge some people to put a submission in around that, and that can be addressed perhaps through that process. Would that be effective?
Yeah, certainly. If there's a concern there, Martin, we can receive that through the submission process.
Right.
Did you have a further question?
No, that's all good for the moment. Thank you.
All right, that's great. Thank you, Martin. We've got Councillor Elliott, then Pravanov, then Hanford.
Thank you very much. Jane and Jason, this is a little bit of a general question, but is this the sort of process that you feel may be, and agility, that you feel may be at risk with the new proposed RMA reforms that are discussed in the last paper?
It's an interesting question. So we're, I guess, reacting here to national direction having some inadvertent consequences, particularly with respect to the accessible car parking and the cycle parking. Central government didn't intend for our accessible car parking and cycle parking provisions to be booted out automatically, like the baby with the bathwater, when they said, "Thou shalt remove your minimum car parking standards." It just so happened that the way our plan was written, that was a consequence. So we're reacting quickly to that and proactively with the Environment Court to make sure that the accessible parking, there was no gap, that there was going to be that requirement that would live on. Would that speed of reaction, I guess, which is the agility that you speak of, would that necessarily happen at a regional level? It's impossible to say.
I get that. Thank you. Thanks for your comments.
Thanks, Jackie. Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Jason, for this presentation. So I have a couple of questions. In point 5, it talks about through stakeholder and public consultation, it's been through that. So I'm just wondering if you could just clarify, what groups, stakeholders, and how that public consultation occurred, please, and who were.
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps I'll start with the Accessibility Advisory Group. That is a group which Council has been working with regularly for a number of years. We did reach out proactively to them and targeted them as a group that we thought really would appreciate having some direct one-on-one feedback opportunities with us. So we sat down in the meeting room at Coastlands Aquatic Centre, actually, and pre-circulated some information before that, met with the whole group, our consultant planner, Christine Foster, and I, and heard what they had to say, and also I think received some further information after the meeting as well. So that was a very useful sort of reconfirmation, I think, that we really were tackling an issue of importance here. They very much validated that accessible parking and its continued provision was really important. And it's actually like reflecting broader on Council's priorities for 2022. Growing well is one of those major priorities, and making sure that new developments are accessible to all has to be an essential part of growing well. So that was a useful conversation that we had with them. In terms of the other consultation that was completed, Laura has summarised that already, but just to go back over that, again, we have gone well over and above what the minimum requirements of the Resource Management Act are for us at this stage of the process. So actually there was public consultation on a draft, which is not actually required by the RMA, but we did that over a 3-week period. We sent the drafts to 4 of our main kapiti resource management consultants directly, basically giving them a bit of a shake and saying, hey, we think you guys might have something useful to say about these plan changes. Again, over and above what we have to do under the Resource Management Act. And as Laura has summarised, there are parties listed in the Act which we do need to have targeted consultation with, which we have done. And those include sort of key ministers, neighbouring local authorities, the regional council, and of course our iwi partners. Now we have, as Laura has mentioned already, reached out over quite a long period of time and a few times to talk about the Omnibus topics with them. And like it's been mentioned in the previous item that Angela led, that iwi capacity, the amount of pull on that is huge. And so we do try to reach out as early as we possibly can and not leave it till the last minute, which would be just the draft provisions. We want to reach out sooner than that, and we have done that. And the feedback that we've got from everyone on these 3 plan changes is, look, they need to prioritise their capacity, and that requires them to make some tough choices about where they put their energies. And the feedback that we got was one of the tough choices they'd have to make is that these 3 plan changes potentially weren't ones that they were going to engage with us on in detail. And so we continue to obviously offer the opportunity, but in the knowledge that that feedback had already come through. And so it transpired that we didn't get any feedback on the drafts of those. But the opportunity will still exist for them, if they so chose, to put a submission in on the notified plan change.
Yeah. So with CWB, were they consulted at all on this in relation to cycle parking?
I'm not familiar with that acronym.
Cycleways, bridleways, walkways group.
Right.
I'm not sure that they were, Laura. If you got any?
Not directly, no.
Not directly. So
what
we
is,
can certainly let them know that, subject to council's decisions today, that there is such a plan change if they weren't already aware of it, because it was advertised reasonably widely in November that this work was going on. But we can certainly reach out directly and let them know.
Yeah, so there's a staff member on that, but I know that person, I think there's only just been a new person appointed into that role, which may have been why it's
Janice.
Yeah. Thank you. So I've got a couple more questions, if you don't mind, but just following up on a comment that Martin was making about retirement villages. Could you maybe explain the hierarchy in terms of where this work fits, that this plan change fits in relation to decisions that retirement homes make on parking availability, including the disability or the accessible parking? So this basically says that they've got to do so much, or is there something else that says that they can get away with slightly less or can do more, obviously?
So retirement villages will be required to get consent under the district plan anyway, irrespective of this plan change, which depending on the specific rules in question is likely to open up opportunities to sort of sort out what is appropriate for car parking. As Laura has indicated, we think potentially that the supported living accommodation line of the table, or row of the table, may be relevant to that as well.
Okay, thank you. So I had one more question. So I have to admit, I've had a query from a person in Waikanae about accessible parking here. And I know it's taking a long time for her to get an answer. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, I'm just talking aloud here, whether or not that delay has been because of this, but possibly not, because I'm not sure as to the time frame this is going to take before it's actually finalised.
I'm not quite sure what the question is there.
Yeah,
Councillor.
so I suppose the timeline would be useful. And what happens, how does it, what can people do in the interim if there are issues that they have in relation to accessible parking? Oh,
so
yes.
that's why we've worked quite hard to link the timing of when the car parking minimum requirements are withdrawn as per the National Policy Statement Urban Development Direction. We've worked really hard to link that timing with the timing of the notification of Plan Change 1A, so that actually both occur simultaneously. And on top of that, we've worked really hard to, I guess, convince the Environment Court.
Sorry, you've cut out.
The plan change, with all of that sort of knitting, halfway cut out.
Yeah, it's a bit patchy.
Okay.
Well, can I add something, Jason? Maybe if anyone has an issue with regard to accessible parking or any other parking related issue, then if they put through a service request, then they'll get a response back from the crowd. The council's not necessarily linked to the work Jason's doing with regard to the district plan changes in terms of responses to requests from the general public.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. There's actually already 2 been in place and some for several months.
Well, happy to follow those offline if you want to forward them to me.
Okay.
Is that all, Councillor Pravanov?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Going to move to Councillor Hanford and then Richard Mansell.
Yeah, kia ora. So thanks, Jason, and thanks, Laura. Just a question around the micro-mobility kind of fitting into the potential for the provision, hopefully increased provision for cycle parking. And wondering, obviously, there'll be an opportunity for people to submit and people are welcome to comment on whether they think that should be included in provision along with increasing the provision itself. I'm just wondering then, can you just explain, partly for my benefit and also maybe for the benefit of people who might be listening, and what the process then is after people make submissions to the publicly notified plan change, how that has the potential to be incorporated in to then inform the change, so that people understand how their submissions could actually influence increased cycle provision, cycle parking provision.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just firstly check, am I coming through okay now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Great. So yeah, absolutely happy to explain the process from here. So following a decision, if that was made today in the affirmative from council, we would then progress to make sure that public notices appeared in some local newspapers with coverage across the district and our internet site, so that the 17th of February would become the sort of the date of public notification, if you like. And look, there are other opportunities I'm sure we can take to spread the word, our everyday kapiti or that kind of a circular is always an opportunity to put some words in there to get the word out. And of course, people are welcome to tap people on the shoulder and go, hey, this might be of interest to you. That opens up a 20 working day period for people to prepare a submission. There is a form that must be sort of followed. This is the Resource Management Act, the act that we're still going to be living with for a number of years to go. And that prescribes that you've got to put your submission in a certain form. And the public notice that we're preparing will provide easy access to what that form looks like. So people write their submission, be very clear about sort of what it is that they're looking for in terms of the decisions that they're requesting. Lodge that with us either electronically, and the public notice will provide some details of which email address to send to, or in written form to council, that's okay too. And so we receive those submissions. We, as a next step, then summarise the decisions that are being requested by people, and that gets separately notified, and that opens up a 10 working day period for people to basically say whether or not they support or oppose the decisions that other people are looking for council to make. So that works its way through. Then if assuming that there are submissions received wanting to be heard, then a hearings panel would be created, and they would sit and consider submissions. So people would have the chance to turn up. If in their submission they say they wish to be heard, they can turn up to the hearing, or maybe depending on COVID situation, it might be much like this, set up virtually. And the hearings panel would then evaluate the evidence they've received, the submissions that have been put forward, and what else people have to say at the hearing. They would then go away and deliberate, evaluate those submissions in the light of national and regional direction, etc., and come up with a report which they would then deliver to council for their consideration. And that report would be essentially reviewing the submissions and giving their recommendations on what they think, if any, changes should be made to the plan changes. Council would then consider the hearing panel's report and typically adopt it as their own decision, but that's a decision that they have to make. And that would then open up the potential for a appeal to the Environment Court to be made. Phew, that's the RMA.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason.
Nothing further, Sophie. Are we going to move to Waikana Community Board member Richard Mansell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wondered, Jason, whether any work had been done on the practical application of these numbers. With my other hat on, I have a shopping mall with 23,000 square meters of space, or lettable space. With my rough calculation, that's 184 visitor car bike parks, and I think it was 58 staff car parks, all of which you're saying need to be undercover within 25 metres of an entrance. Is that correct? Have you done any practical work of what this will look like on the ground?
So you're talking there, I think, about the cycle parking. That's
yes.
Plan Change 1C.
Yeah. Yes.
Laura, do you have any comment to make on the kind of the origin?
Yes, so for the cycle parking standards, they came from Waka Kotahi's NZTA's guidance around cycle parking provisions. There is a table that they put out with different land uses, and within that there is certain levels that you can provide of service for them, depending on the size, whether you're a city or a town or a rural community. So we had a look through those and tried to pick some that would be would seem to match where Kapiti is sitting, but also mindful that we are classed as a tier 1 urban environment under the MP and National Policy Statement on Urban Development. So yeah, we're really keen to test it more through submissions. It would be good to get feedback on proposals that, yeah, maybe of the larger scale, that will probably need resource consent anyway, and could have a bit more flexibility around those numbers. And there may be other options as well with bigger scale developments. They'll be required to look at travel plans, that sort of management, which could actually, through the resource consent process, be deemed it wouldn't be necessary to have an excessive number, or there are other ways of managing it, or there's better public transport facilities. But all of that can be assessed through the resource consent process and through travel planning management.
So what you're saying is that the resource consent process is where someone of a large scale will try to opt out of the prescriptive nature, and that gives them the opportunity to not to comply with the numbers that you've got.
So the numbers are permitted activity standards. So they are, in a way, they set an expectation, but they also trigger a resource consent. But if a resource consent is required for other reasons, then it's a chance to look at it holistically and look at other options, particularly for those larger scale developments. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair, I guess this is more, this is a more general question than rather something specific about this, but where there are resource consents that have already been lodged, they presumably get assessed under the existing rules and not the ones that would be like the accessible parking that would be given effect as soon as it's notified. They all get assessed under what the rules were at the time of their lodging.
That's right, and I guess with the accessible parking, that the aim is to provide essentially a kind of a smooth gapless period where nobody really notices the difference, because the numbers for those are, except for the multi-unit requirements, which is a new requirement. Everything else is, from a numbers required perspective, a carryover from what's actually in the plan right now.
Cool, perfect. Thank you.
All right, team, I don't see any further hands up, and I think we've had a good crack at that. It's quite a meaty document with a lot of information in there. Essentially, the plan changes and recommendations, A, and then in B, it's the approval to proceed around public notification as well. So with that, do we have someone that's happy to move the recommendations found on page 66 through to 67? Councillor McCann putting his real hand up, and a seconder. Councillor Elliott. So with that, I'm going to move into debate with a right of introduction from Councillor McCann.
Kia ora. Firstly, just want to thank the team, Jason, for the enormous amount of work that's going on behind the scenes to try and get this all through. And I definitely support this paper being public notified. As I've suggested to you privately in an email, that it's really important, though, that when we do notify this, that we include that story, the narrative, that this is part of a suite of changes, so that we don't get the public saying, what are you doing about this, this, and this, when actually there's a plan. One of the things, and it's not a question, it was raised with Jason and the team around electric vehicle charging, and I did see that there was a lack of information there and support to ensure that we are trying to make sure that the charging spaces are available in those multi-dwell units. And Jason has come back and said that's we don't have the information yet, and it could be part of a future omnibus plan. So on that basis, that we do make sure that we are future-proofing and trying to encourage the use of vehicles that are better for our environment, then I support this change. Thanks very much, Jason.
Thanks, Rob. So elected members, if you've got any questions, pop your hand up. I see Councillor Elliott, your hand's up from, I presume, seconding. I just want to check whether you've got a thank you. I don't see any other hands up, so I am going to move to putting the motion to the vote, unless someone quickly pops their hand up. Doesn't appear to be. So recommendation A and B on pages 66 and 67, moved by Councillor McCann, seconded by Councillor Elliott. I'm going to put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye with your reactions tab. And against is the red. And just let Dem Services count those votes. And sorry, Councillor McCann, I didn't give you a right of reply, but there wasn't really the need for one.
Councillor Buswell, are you voting? There we go. We have 10 yeses.
Excellent. That is passed. Laura and Jason, thank you for the thorough report and just walking that through us. Team, we're going to take a short break for, say, 5 minutes. And if we can be prompt and back at 11:25, we'll move on to the next part of the paper. Just reminding you, we've got a couple of other sessions this afternoon. So short break, 11:25, and we'll back into it. Sorry, just reminding you to mute and stop your